Well, thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you for taking this time out of your week, out of this Sunday, this holiday weekend, to come together and to consider some ideas about just what freedom is, what independence is, what liberty is, and how does all of that function under law. So we're going to talk today in a couple different veins here, a couple different threads kind of weaving through the talk. There's going to be the thread of kind of like biological evolution, how Thomas Troward described us, or life itself, moving into the fifth kingdom, the spiritual kingdom. We're going to talk a little bit about political evolution, how the way that human beings kind of organized and allowed themselves to be organized for the sake of governing. How is that kind of an outpicturing of consciousness, a reflection of this of the human spirit? And then, of course, we're going to be talking about our spiritual evolution, you and I, our personal unfoldment under the law. Dr. Holmes tells us that all is love and all is law, and we really have to kind of get a grasp of what that means. All is love and all is law. And what is this law? And he tells us that it's the same law that binds us as the law that will set us free. And if we're not free, if we're not experiencing all of the freedom that we desire, well, we simply have to learn to work or cooperate with that law. So we're going to kind of weave those three things together and and see how they come together in us. The important thing is the individual freedom, the individual independence, the individual operating under law. And by the law we're talking, it's called by many different laws, but there's only one. But think of it, it is done unto you according to your belief. It is done unto you according to your belief. And that's enough. Now people will say, well, there's a law of attraction, and there's a law of prosperity, and there's a law of healing, and there's a law of this, there's a law of that. There's only one. There's only one. It is done unto you according to your belief. Now that's a mouthful, because then we have to get into what is belief. How do I change my beliefs? Those sorts of things. So the first thing let's talk about is just talk a little bit about the history of the United States of America, the history of the holiday that we're celebrating this weekend. I realize that the 4th of July is on Wednesday of next week, but they're going to celebrate in many places on Monday to make it a 3-day weekend. And what we're officially celebrating, what the country is officially recognizing, is that on the 4th of July 1776, that is the date that is recognized as the official Declaration of Independence, the official document that the signers of the Declaration of Independence, if you're a visual person, you can see the big John Hancock signature right across the center of the bottom of the page, you know. But these men who we call the Founding Fathers, these men got together and made official what was kind of going on in people's minds. They made official the idea that the colonies, that the 13 colonies in what is now the United States, declared for themselves autonomy the right to be on an equal status, not governed by, but on an equal status with the monarchy in England. And it's very interesting if you read through the document. It's kind of a spiritual document, because it starts out and it says that all persons are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. And amongst those, not limited to, but amongst those, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that governments are instituted to preserve these rights with the consent of the governed. Now I'm paraphrasing and I'm leaving a lot out, but I want you to just kind of capture the essence of that. It starts with an acknowledgement of God by whatever, with the Creator by whatever image those people had at the time. But there's this something that created, and it endowed its creation. It endowed its creation with rights that cannot be changed. No one can take them away. They're unalienable. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, amongst others. And governments are instituted to preserve those rights with the consent of the governed. Now these ideas had been floating around for some time, in different ways and in different shapes, and through the years. We're going to talk about that just a little bit. But I invite you, if you're into history, if you like studying history, I invite you to kind of consider what are the actual causes of the American Revolution. As school children, we were given a list of things, and we were told, these are kind of the grievances that the leaders of the colonies had against England. But I ask you to consider that history is written by the winners. And school books and history books are published by the people who had the ways and means to do so. Now, we didn't have the internet back then. We are in a much different world today, you and I, than it was back in the late 1700s. Because only one side of an issue could get out, because whoever had the resources could do it. But before the official Declaration of Independence that we recognize in 1776, there were other declarations of independence. There were other documents from within the colonies and from within certain counties within the colonies, kind of saying, yeah, this is it. We declare ourselves to be free. Of course, I live right on the North Carolina-South Carolina line, and I lived in North Carolina for many years. And one famous one, if you want to look, is called the Mecklenburg Resolves. And then there's another one that came from Halifax County, North Carolina. But there were different movements. There were different pockets and different movements where people were saying, we want to be free. We are free. We're declaring that we are free. Now, before the American Revolution, there was something that took place here in the Carolinas that was called the War of Regulation. And I find a lot of people do not know about this. But the War of Regulation was actually between the backwoods farmers, the subsistence farmers, the kind of like the working class people, and the colonial government. And the people felt that the colonial government was corrupt. It was not looking out in their best interest. It was taking advantage of them. In South Carolina, it was using them to buffer the wilderness from civilization, which was in those days Charleston. And this actually came to an armed rebellion in North Carolina. And the colonial governor of North Carolina sent the militia out to put down this rebellion. And many of the men who led the militia, we know their names because the counties in North Carolina are named after them. And they actually fired upon and and killed some of their fellow citizens, and then took others out and executed them. And what's amazing to me about this, the only reason I bring it up is because it shows an evolution of consciousness. It shows kind of something moving through consciousness. Because within 10 years' time, these same men who were the militia leaders who fired on the farmers of North Carolina, they became the Sons of Liberty. They became the leaders of the American Revolution. They became the people who supported this Declaration of Independence. So whereas the farmers were saying, you know, we want to be treated fairly by the colonial government, here now you have these men who led the militia, who were generally the wealthy merchants and planters from down the east. Now they're in turn turning back towards England and saying, you're not treating us fairly, we want to be free. There's this idea then that we're not being treated fairly. There's this idea that we deserve to be treated fairly, and it is kind of pushing itself forward. In this case, not in a political evolution, but it was a political revolution. And it didn't stop. It didn't stop with the Revolutionary War. In 1786, up in New York and Connecticut, there was a continuation of the War of Regulation. It was called Shays' Rebellion, and these were men who came back from fighting the Revolutionary War, who found that while they were gone, the corrupt landlords and landowners and land agents sold their farms right out from underneath them. And that too led to an armed rebellion. And then that pushed towards the Constitutional Convention, that pushed towards this need to move out from the Articles of Confederation and to kind of find a way, to try to find a way to balance the powers, to create this idea of fairness, to be able to enforce these ideas of fairness. So I just mention that because what Emmett Fox tells us, and there's a little booklet, and you can get it on, I looked it up this morning, you can buy it online at Google for 99 cents, and you can read it online. It's a little pamphlet, and it's called The Historical Destiny of the United States. It's only a few pages long. And I think the second part of it is called The Mystery of Money. And if you've ever wondered about the symbols on the back of the dollar bill, he kind of goes into his interpretation of a lot of those. But what Emmett Fox was saying is, if you look at the history of politics and political evolution and political revolution throughout history, that every time we take a step forward, now granted sometimes we take a step forward and we take two back, and then we have to come back forward again, but every time we kind of move forward, we are moving toward a greater degree of freedom and a greater degree of responsibility for the individual. So millennia ago, you know, the individual was property owned by the monarchy. You know, there were subjects, and the monarchy could do whatever it wanted with them. They just their life and their death and these kind of things were just by the will of the strong leader. And people, they kind of moved. We kind of moved out of sort of the tribal system. We moved to a feudal system, which gave a little bit more freedom to the individual. But the idea was still that, you know, the monarchy owned the land, and the people lived on the land by the grace of the monarch. And of course, they had to pay rent, and this was the way that they made money. And we even see that in the colonies when this idea moved to this continent, that the King of England granted large tracts of land to the landlords, and basically told them, you need to generate a certain amount of revenue every year and return it to me. And if you can't, I will take your grant away and I will give it to somebody else. Right? So this kind of then led to the land agents kind of divide the land and sell the land off, and they being so far removed from any sense of control, what they were doing was they were selling the same piece of land over and over and over again. farmers would come in and they would work the land for several years and improve it, and the land agent would come back and say, oh, you can't be here. Somebody else already owns this land. And they were getting the land improved, and then they were reselling it again and doing the same thing. So human consciousness rebelled against that idea. Human consciousness pushed back against that idea. The individual should be allowed to own the property. The individual should be allowed to determine their fate through their ability to work the land and those sorts of things. So what Emmett Fox is telling us is if you go back and you try to track the political evolution through the centuries, that there's this something within the human spirit, there's this something within us that knows that we ought to be free, that desires that. And I think that's kind of a key point we have to consider in our spiritual growth. Augustine tells us that we wouldn't even have the desire to pray if God had not first put it in our hearts. We have this desire to be free. We have this desire to express freedom. We have this desire to make our own decisions, to choose our own way through life. And then you have to wonder, would a kind and loving Creator create us and let us have that desire if it were not possible to fulfill it? Nature does not mock itself. God does not mock its own children. And as I spoke back on Father's Day, we are more than God's children. Thinking of God as the Father is a limiting idea. The relationship with God is so much more than that. To me, it's as if we are compelled to fulfill our potential. Thou hast created us for thyself. Our hearts remain restless until they repose in thee. We have to fulfill our potential of experiencing the fullness of the presence of God. And as we're told over and over again in many different cultures in many different ways, right, we have to let go of the things that are holding us back. We have to let go of the ideas that limit us. Nothing blemished can enter the presence of the divine, is the way a theologian might say it. Right? This led to the whole idea of purgatory in the Catholic Church. Right? There had to be a place that you go to get purified for a while before you go to heaven. But I invite you to think of it in a different way. That which is perfect, that which is whole, that which is complete, that which is pure light cannot know darkness, cannot know the darkness. The beam of light passes through miles and miles and miles of darkness, and it is totally unaffected by the darkness. It is totally unfazed by the darkness. See, the darkness is not a reality. It does not have the power to sustain itself. So the divine doesn't know that there's a blemish. Emma Curtis Hopkins says there is no such thing as sin, sickness, or death. And we hear that and say, well, my goodness, how can she say that? Just look around you. The divine knows nothing of these things. The visual that helps me is to think of that picture of the earth, that blue marble floating out in space, that was taken from the Apollo astronauts. And the sun is shining down and it is illuminating one side of the earth, and it is, from the sun's point of view, it is completely oblivious to what's going on the other side, on the dark side. And the instant that the earth rotates and that which was in darkness comes into the darkness goes away. The darkness disappears. So the sunshine knows nothing of the darkness. And divine love knows nothing of our ideas of limitation. But we do. We do. And because we have limited ideas, because we have not fully grown into our freedom, we experience the result, the logical outcome, the logical outpicturing of our consciousness. So Dr. Holmes tells us that we live in a spiritual universe, and by spiritual he means consciousness, right? And that what he calls the law of mind is a natural law in a spiritual universe, a natural law in a spiritual universe. So what we can see when we look at the political history of the world, we can see an unfoldment in consciousness, that human consciousness, collective consciousness, race consciousness, if you want to call it that, human consciousness has been moving towards this ideal of expressing the freedom, because we have to let go of the limiting ideas. We have to let go of the limiting ideas as we grow in spirit. Right? It's like the story, whether it's true or not, I don't know, the story of Michelangelo and carving the angel out of the slab. So you just chip away everything that doesn't look like the angel. And then I've read that sculptors will look at a block of stone until they see, in their mind's eye, they see a form emerge from it. And it's as if that form is imprisoned in that block, and they have to chisel away everything that's not like it. Our destiny as we grow is that we let go. A couple weeks ago I talked about minusing, not plussing. We let go of the limiting ideas. And I think you can see the political evolution as we let go of these limiting ideas. And the individual says, I ought to be more in control of my own destiny. I ought to be free to do that which I wish to do. And Emmett Fox says, and I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to come back to it in a few minutes. He says, then what is the logical outcome of that? What is the destiny of that unfoldment of consciousness? If you follow that unfoldment, if you follow that stream of thought from believing that we are subjects to some monarch out there who has the ability to decide life or death over us at his or her whim, to, hey, I am free. I am the one who decides. Where does that take us? So that's the political evolution. Thomas Troward, just very briefly, he talks about natural evolution in the spiritual realm. So he says, if you think that life itself, whatever our idea of life itself is, it might be God, it might be Creator, it might be divine love, but there's this life force. I think it's called Gaia in Hindu terminology. There's this life force itself, you know. The planet is alive. The universe is alive. The same force that animates the trees animates the human body. The same force that animates the grass animates the cows that eat the grass. There is this very essence of life that is manifesting itself. And the way that Thomas Troward looked at it, he said that it develops in stages, it moves in stages, you know. So you think in the beginning there was the void, there was a chaos, there was nothing, there was just pure nothing. Perhaps not even energy, but there was just this nothing. But there must have been something. It's ineffable. We can't describe it, but it caused, through an act of consciousness, which is thought. We live in a spiritual universe, a universe of consciousness, a universe of thought. It caused the physical universe to come into creation. Right? Physicists might say there was nothing, then there was the Big Bang, and then boom, there was something. Genesis would say, in the beginning there was nothing, and then the voice of the Spirit moved upon the face of the waters. In other cultures we're told that the God opened its eyes and the universe appeared. they're all getting down to the idea that creation is an act of consciousness, an act of will, an act of volition on the part of some power. And Troward asks us to consider that it first comes into existence as the mineral, right? As the rocks and the minerals and the planets and the things around us. But the minerals are alive. The minerals, we would look at them and say, well, they're just laying there. They're just rocks just laying there. Basic principle of matter is that it is inert. Matter is just laying there, but it's still moving and vibrating, and electrons are moving, and quantum physicists will say, well, electrons aren't always there, but they just sometimes are there and sometimes are not. And so it's very dynamic, even though it looks static. And then somehow the life principle formed these basic molecules, these minerals, into plants. And then somehow those plants evolved into animals, into fish, into mammals, into reptiles, and all those things. And then somehow that life force expressing through it came into existence as what we call the human beings. And at each level of evolution, you can see a greater degree of intelligence and a greater degree of mobility, or perhaps freedom, right? It moves, right? So the minerals don't move, they just kind of stay there, even though within themselves they're vibrating and moving and electrons are whirling. But when we get into the plant life, we can start to see plants move, you know. I love to watch the leaves turn over on the grapevine as they follow the sun, or the sunflowers as they track the sun across the fields. Plants can move. And then when you get into the world of the animals, there's more movement. And then when you get into the world of the human being, we have even more movement. We build machines to move us wherever we want to go. And Troward says that that is as far as the biological process of evolution is going to take us, because then we step into the fifth kingdom, which is the spiritual kingdom, where we awaken to the fact that we are spiritual beings. We are spiritual beings. We are consciousness. We are thought. And the creative power of the universe is thought. This is why we say there's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. Exactly according to our belief. So if we take all of those things together, then what we come to realize is that you and I, or what we think we are actually the divine life in expression as us. And as it is free, we are free. We are free and we are independent, but under the law. So we need to talk about what that means to us, under the law. As a basic principle, I'm switching back now to political law, I'm switching back to governments and everything. There's kind of a fundamental principle that even though each citizen in the country is free to express life, to express liberty, and to pursue happiness, you can't do that in a way that takes away from another. And I think that gets lost in the public shouting match that goes on, particularly in social media and things like that. You know, I've heard people say, well, if the majority of the people in the country want this, then we ought to have it. Well, no, not if it takes from another, not if it offends another, you know. We can't do that. If the majority of the people got together and we decided to vote to take all the money away from the banks and distribute it amongst ourselves, which I'm sure somebody's already thought of that, we would find, well, you can't do that, you see. Your rights cannot intrude on another. One way I explained it, one time I was talking to a fellow who had a piece of land up in Catawba County in North Carolina. And he was kind of expressing anarchistic views that the government had no right to tell anybody what to do on their land, that it was his land, and by God, he could do whatever he wanted to do with it. And I said, well, how much land do you have? And he said, well, he said, I've got about 7 acres of land there. And I said, well, how far is your house from the property line? And he said, well, my house is only a couple hundred yards from one of the property lines because it's kind of built in the corner of the lot. I said, so if I buy the land next door and I come in and I want to put a big animal feedlot in there and I want to raise hogs for market and put a hog farm 200 yards from your house, that's okay because the government shouldn't tell me what to do. And he stopped and he thought about it. He says, he says, I understand your point. He says, I understand your point. There has to be some restriction. There has to be something that makes it fair for everyone, right? We can do whatever we want as long as it doesn't take away from another. And this is all Dr. Holmes is telling us about the law. He said, whatsoever good thing you desire, ask yourself, does it give a greater expression of life? Does it give a greater expression of love? Does it give a greater expression of truth? Does it give a greater expression of beauty? If any of those are a yes, then ask yourself, does it rob anyone of anything? Does it harm anyone in any way? And if both of those are no, then do it. Then do it, because all of the world is for you. All of the universe is for you. All of God is for you. It reminds me of the passages in the Bible. It says the trees will bow down and the mountaintops will remove their tops as you pass by. Because that desire then, if you pass those tests, that desire is a desire to express life more fully, more freely, more completely. So Troward is telling us then that the natural evolution that we go through is leading us toward a greater degree of intelligence and a greater degree of freedom. That seems to be the destiny that we're moving. Emmett Fox takes that then and he puts it into the political context and he says the evolution of our governments, which governments are just a reflection of the consciousness of the people, right? I mean, especially now, we say the government governs with the consent of the governed. The government is a reflection of the consciousness, not everybody's individual consciousness, but kind of the collective and the race consciousness. And that too, that political evolution is moving us towards a greater degree of intelligence and a greater degree of freedom and a greater degree of accountability under the law. And what I mean by that is there's one power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. And Dr. Holmes tells us that same power that would keep us in bondage is the power that would set us free. We have to understand that we cannot escape. We cannot escape the fact that there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. We are functioning under that law. We are functioning under the law of gravity. You and I cannot escape gravity. We are always affected by it. Even when we're in an airplane, even when we're flying in a plane, even though the plane is able to counteract by appealing to a higher law, a law of lift, for example, it can temporarily use a lot of energy to counteract the force of gravity. Even though it is kind of defying gravity, the coffee in your cup stays in your cup because gravity is still at work. So you might say, for example, well, we have this law of gravity and we can't escape this law of gravity, and what are we going to do? But through our intelligence, we learn how the law of gravity works, and we learn how to cooperate with it, and we learn how to use it for good, for a greater expression of life. Perhaps good was not the right word. For a more complete expression of life. So now we learn how gravity works, and we can build airplanes, and we can build rocket ships, and we can build water wheels, and we can build water slides, and we can do all kinds of things because we understand how gravity works. So we're not prisoners of gravity, even though you could say, well, it's not fair, we're kind of stuck to the ground and the birds can go wherever they want. Well, we can use our intelligence. We can learn how to cooperate. We can make conscious choices. Once we understand that there's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief, and we start to grow spiritually, we say we can cooperate with that power for whatever good purpose. Good being doesn't harm anyone, doesn't rob anyone, doesn't take anything away from anyone, for any good purpose that we desire. But we have to learn how to cooperate, the same way that scientists have learned how to cooperate with gravity. Now, I just want to introduce one quick point here, and this is the difference between liberty and license. The liberty and license. And Holmes makes this point in a textbook. We have liberty, we don't have license. Liberty, we are free to do, to think, to act in any way that we choose, but that does not give us the license to harm another. That does not give us the license to think or to act or behave in any way we want and not experience the consequences of the law. If you misuse the law, you will suffer the consequences of the law, not because a God is punishing you, but because what you are putting into the law is what you are getting back. If you turn on the gas stove, through the laws of physics, you get fire and you get heat. And if you put your hand in that flame, you will get burned. You have misused that power. So what we come to recognize then is that we as human beings, as we are coming into this awareness of our spiritual nature, we never want to misuse the law. We don't want to try to take anything from another. We don't want to try to harm another. We don't want license, and we know we can't have license. What we want is liberty for all. I want the same thing for everyone that I want for myself. To grow every day in the conscious awareness of the love and the presence of God. So sometimes what happens when we get into this conversation, people say, well, if we didn't have laws amongst men, just think of what would happen. Even though we have laws and our prisons are full, we still have people robbing and stealing and all of those things. And yes, we do. While we're growing, we need those things. Right? We need some way to deal with those things. But ultimately, if everyone was coming from a place of love, we would not. And that's the destiny that we're talking about. You say, well, what are you telling me now? That I shouldn't worry about these things. I should just learn to love. That I don't need to worry about laws. That I don't need to worry about governments. And what I'm saying is, you need to take personal responsibility for your thoughts. See, as we grow spiritually and as we recognize that governments are instituted amongst people by the consent of the governed, which is the idea that we came into in a greater degree of awareness in 1776, we eventually have to learn that I am responsible for the governance of my own life. I am the only thinker in my universe. And I can separate myself from race consciousness. Right? Holmes tells us that the purpose of our spiritual practice is to insulate, isolate, and inoculate ourselves from the race consciousness. So sometimes we get into this conversation about, but life isn't fair, and the government isn't always fair, and sometimes laws are unjust, and this, that, and the other thing, and we've got to stop right there and say, why are we identifying with that? Emmett Fox says it doesn't make a difference if you're supposed to be in court on Monday and you find your spiritual truth on Sunday, the case will be dismissed. The case will be dismissed. Now, we have a hard time believing that because we have so much experience in the ways of the world, the Machiavellian ways of the world, and how things work and how power works and how people connive and all these things. But we have to step back and separate ourselves from that. That is not for us. That is not our interest. That is not our destiny. Our destiny is to love. Our destiny is to express and experience and enjoy the perfect freedom that is. As God is free, we are free. And we look at that and say, well, if that's the case, then why didn't God just make us completely free to start with? Well, the answer is God did make us completely free to start with, under the law, under the law. You could say if it was destined that human beings would build airplanes, why didn't we just get wings and fly like the birds? Because we had to develop along a specific line of spiritual evolution to come to this awareness and be individual. You can't compel freedom. You cannot force people to be free. You know, if I'm forcing you to be free, you're not free. You're forced to be free, if that makes any sense. I was working with an executive one time in a company, and the problem they were facing is that the marketing environment had changed significantly around them. And they had all of these different business units that were making different different product lines for different customers, and each business unit was headed up by a very successful person who got there because they were good competitors, right? They rose to the top by competing. And now we had reached a point in the evolution of the business environment where collaboration was a more important quality than competition, or a more important skill. And I explained to this man, I said, the problem that you have is that you need all of these great competitors to suddenly collaborate, and they don't know how to do it. It's not part of their nature. They're all jockeying for your job. They're all trying to get one more rung up on the ladder. And he said, well, suppose I made collaboration a contest and I awarded a prize for the best collaborator. And I just chuckled. I couldn't help but laugh, you know. And then I was embarrassed that I did, you know. And he said, yeah, he said, I understand. They would fake it to win. They wouldn't be collaborating. They would give the illusion of collaborating. So we have to learn to be free. We have to come into that awareness of our own. This is the awakening, right? This is the rebirth. This is throwing off the old Adam and putting on the new. We have to come to this realization that we are spiritual beings on our own. And in that way, we are something unique. We are something different. We are not a little cookie cutter automaton, as Dr. Holmes would call us, a little robot. But we are unique, beautiful expression of the divine. Now, what else we can learn from Independence Day and from the Declaration of Independence is that it is one thing to say intellectually that I am free, that there's a power in the universe that responds to me according to my belief, but you have to declare that. You have to make that statement to yourself. You have to put that into action. If you read further through the Declaration of Independence, they're very specific. Right? The Declaration of Independence is almost like spiritual mind treatment. They started out with what God is, the Creator. What we are in relationship to God. We are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, self-governance. You and I have all of those as individuals, but they declared it, they said it, and then they committed to it with their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honors. The freedom is already here, the power is already here, the wisdom is already here. Omnipotence, omniscience is omnipresence. It is already here. But what we must do, just like scientists working with gravity, we must learn how to work with our consciousness. We must learn how to work with our belief. We must declare our spiritual nature and be willing to step into the fullness of that, and to back it up with our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. What are we without the divine? What are we without love? As Rumi tells us, like the moth going into the flame for the bliss of the momentary union with the divine. Are we willing to let go of all of our old ideas? Are we willing to let go of everything we have in order to step into that next experience, which is the fifth kingdom, which is to become aware of our spiritual nature and live accordingly. So what we look at in politics is a reflection of human consciousness. It is a reflection of spiritual evolution. And what it tells us is that you and I, the destiny that Emmett Fox talks about is that eventually we will be independent. We will not need governments to tell us what is right and wrong. We know what's right and wrong. We will not need governments to tell us to love our neighbor, because we will do that because we are our neighbor and they are us. Eventually, we will not need armies. That is the destiny. Now, what we can do is you and I can step into that at the individual level today. It may take race consciousness a while to get there. Race consciousness may never get there. Somebody once asked Dr. Holmes, they said, aren't you afraid with the development of a nuclear bomb that the human beings could completely destroy the human race on this planet? And his answer was yes. He says, they can do that. He says, but consciousness would just go someplace else and start all over again. It would just go someplace else and start all over again. So race consciousness may take a while to get there. What about your consciousness? What about my consciousness? And it's not a hard job. It's not like doing crunches to tighten up your abs. All we are required to do is to keep our mind on the truth and the beauty and the love and ignore the appearances. Don't get caught up in the appearances. Don't get caught up in that which is nothing, pretending to be something. I was reading a story, I think it was in one of Alan Cohen's books, and he was talking about a tribe of primitive people. They were hunter-gatherers, and they lived in a jungle somewhere. And monkeys were food. They used the monkey as a supply of food. And the way that they captured the monkey was they took a gourd and they cut a small hole in the gourd, just small enough that the monkey could get its flat hand into that hole. And then they filled the gourd with the foods that the substances that the monkey ate, the nuts, the berries, whatever. And the monkey would come along and put its hand in that gourd, and it would reach down and it would grab a fistful of that food. And of course it couldn't get its hand back out the hole. It was stuck. And then the hunters would come along and they would have that monkey. And what trapped the monkey was it would not let go. It kept holding on, see. Our growth is in letting go. Don't get caught up in the appearances. If you find yourself getting caught up in the appearances, turn immediately to the truth. God is all there is. God is all knowing. God is all powerful. God is everywhere present. All presence. It is present here as me. And I now declare my good. So as the rest of the country goes off and shoots off fireworks and barbecues, hot dogs and all those kind of things, I invite you, please take some time to ask yourself, what is your declaration of independence? Are you willing to step forward and declare yourself to be a spiritual being? Are you willing to let go of the old limiting ideas? And not by wrestling with them and getting in and trying to dig them up, but by simply turning away. Turn away from the shadow and turn towards the light, you know. If you face the sun, you don't see your shadow. Can you take time? Can you take time to be at home with the beloved, to be still and know, and to surrender and to accept the goodness that has already been given, because you are that expression of life and of liberty and of freedom under the law, and so it is.